Friends, today is Wednesday, the 14th of October. We're in the cathedral, and I have over my right shoulder the statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Always a good meditation for us, the love and the mercy of Jesus that we need to show ourselves. And today we have a gospel that probably most people will read and kind of shrug. It doesn't really apply to them. It's Jesus' critique of the scribes, the Pharisees, the scholars of the law. It's Luke's woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, scholars of the law. But there's a certain group of people to whom this reading indeed makes a great deal of sense, and it catches our attention, and that is religious leaders, because Jesus turns his critique today to religious leaders and the troubles they get into. You know, as I've said before, that scriptures are always present. Jesus is not simply critiquing scribes and Pharisees 2,000 years ago, but he's critiquing religious leaders today. And so some of us who are religious leaders pay attention. Our ears kind of stand up a bit to hear, well, what does Jesus say? And what is it that we need to be aware of as religious leaders? And the critique of Jesus to religious leaders is on the ways that they can fall into corruption. Leaders can use the law, they can use their personal piety as ways to inflate their egos. And you know, the clergy are not any different from anyone else, given the temptations that all of us face. Clergy are the same. But their life and their lifestyle and all that surrounds their life is a kind of seedbed for many, many different temptations. And why is it that clerics in particular fall from grace? Well, it's not rocket science. It's kind of evident, really, because our life, take a look at our life, what we possess: power, money, influence, enormous influence, respect of everyone. And frankly, we're really not accountable. We're not accountable to anyone. Well, you might say, well, you're accountable to the bishop, but that is true. But how does that happen in a very practical way? Most clergy probably never see the bishop and go about their business day to day, really accountable to no one. I'm perhaps more aware than most of some of the challenges that seminarians and clergy get into. I spent many years in the seminary myself. 12 years, in fact, in the seminary. Then I spent 10 years as rector of a seminary. And then I spent 3 years as a spiritual director of seminarians. And after that, I spent 10 years as vicar for clergy, working directly with the clergy. And so I perhaps know more than most what the temptations are and what we fall into as clergy and need to be attentive to. You know, Jesus, speaking about scribes and Pharisees and the ways in which they try to inflate their ego, what they wear, what these scribes and Pharisees wear, where they sit in the synagogue, the clothes they wear, the cars they drive, at least today, the mansions they live in. All of this goes contrary to the preaching of Jesus and what it means to be a servant leader. All of these trappings of the clergy neither serves them nor the people. And thus we need to be attentive to it, we who are clergy. I remember in Rome, I worked in Rome for a number of years, and if there ever was a seedbed for temptation to grandeur, to money, to power, is life in Rome. Because you see all around you the magnificent Renaissance splendor of the church, and the wealth and the power of the church. And seminarians can easily be drawn into that, unless, of course, people like myself who were their spiritual directors challenge them. I remember once going for a walk in the city of Rome, which is full of ecclesiastical stores, ecclesiastical clothes, ecclesiastical trappings, and walked by one store and looked in the window, and I saw inside a group of seminarians from the college where I was a spiritual director, and I went in and walked over to where the students were and saw what they were looking at. They were looking at ecclesiastical rings. In other words, episcopal rings worn on the right hand, not the left, like a wedding ring. And I said, well, what are you guys looking at? Well, they were a little embarrassed. And I said to them, don't get any thoughts. Don't get any thoughts about Episcopal glory. And these were students, maybe first or second year students, already caught up in the trappings. You know, as the rector of a seminary, I could oftentimes tell on the first day a student would arrive what kind of priest that man would be, how big the U-Haul was of all his possessions. He kind of pushed into a tiny little room. Anyway, all of that, seminarians, priests are like everyone else, except we have sometimes a greater temptation because of our life. But counter to all of that is the first reading today, a beautiful reading from Paul's letter to the Galatians, in which he, first of all, singles out the works of the flesh, and as a spiritual director for seminarians and for clergy, this is kind of a list of the troubles we get into. But secondly, Paul gives us the fruits of the Spirit, and lists them. You know, I went back to the old catechism to see if I remembered the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit and the 12 gifts of the Holy Spirit. The 12 fruits, rather, of the Holy Spirit. You know, if we live those gifts and we live those fruits, we really have nothing to worry about. We will become servant leaders, avoiding all the trapping, all the woes, the critique of Jesus about spiritual leaders, and not simply try to inflate our egos, but to serve. And the gifts and the fruits of the Spirit are something all of us have received. Gifts and fruits that we need to love. Let me just list the gifts for us to consider. Hold this thought: wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, fear of the Lord. The 7 gifts of the Spirit, the 7 gifts which keep us on track as Christians. Hold that thought, and we'll see you tomorrow.